He saved the drowning Apache woman. In return, they spent one night under the same roof. The sun was beginning to set behind the jagged mountains in the distance, casting long shadows across the riverbed. For a moment, everything felt still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. But then, the sound came again, a desperate cry for help. The cowboy, whose name was Jack, squinted into the distance. There was no one in sight, just the river flowing quietly along the edge of the land. But the cry rang out once more, piercing the quiet of the evening. Jack's heart raced as he spurred his horse into action. The river was treacherous at this point, especially with the waters running fast from the mountain snowmelt. He had crossed it many times before, but it was always dangerous. No one would dare cross it alone, especially not someone who didn't know the land. And yet here was this cry, coming from somewhere beyond the rocks. As he neared the river, Jack saw a figure struggling in the water. It was a woman, her dark hair flowing behind her like a tangled mess, her clothes soaked and clinging to her body. She was caught in the strong current, barely able to keep her head above water. Her arms flailed in panic as she tried to reach the shore, but the force of the river was too much for her. Without thinking, Jack pulled his horse to a halt and jumped off. He grabbed the rope from the saddle, tying it quickly to a nearby tree. He had to move fast. Time was running out for the woman in the water. "Hold on," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the air. He didn't know if she could hear him over the sound of the rushing water, but he had to try. Without waiting for a response, Jack waded into the river, his boots sinking into the muddy riverbed. The cold water cut through his clothes like ice, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the woman. She was struggling harder now, her hands reaching out in desperation. Jack fought against the current, pushing his way toward her. He felt the water pull at his legs, trying to drag him downstream, but he kept his eyes on her. With every step, he felt the weight of the river trying to take him under. But he pressed on, knowing that he had no choice. Finally, he reached her and he grabbed her by the arm. She gasped, her wide eyes meeting his, but she was too weak to struggle. Jack knew he had to act quickly. He pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her waist and holding her tightly as he started to move back toward the shore. The current was relentless, pushing against them, but Jack managed to steady himself. With each step, he dragged her closer to the shore. His muscles burned from the effort, but he refused to stop. He wasn't going to let her drown. After what felt like an eternity, they finally made it to the riverbank. Jack collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving as he pulled the woman to safety. He checked her pulse, still weak but there. He could hear her shallow breaths, and that was enough. He lay there beside her for a moment, letting the sounds of the river fade into the background. The world seemed to slow down, and Jack allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He had done it. He had saved her. The woman, still unconscious, lay in the dirt beside him. Her skin was pale, her face drawn with exhaustion. Jack checked her over quickly. She didn't appear to be seriously injured, just cold and terrified. The river had taken a lot out of her, but with time, she would recover. Jack stood up slowly, taking off his jacket and draping it over her. He knew that she needed warmth, but he also knew he couldn't leave her like this. She would need help, more than he could provide alone. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere where she could rest and recover. Jack glanced around, trying to get his bearings. There was a small cabin not far from the river. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for tonight. He didn't know if she would want to stay with him, if she would even trust him after what had just happened, but he had no choice. He couldn't leave her out here, not in this condition. He gently picked her up, careful not to jostle her too much, and carried her in his arms. She felt light, almost fragile in his grip. Her head rested against his chest, and for a moment, Jack wondered who she was and where she had come from. She didn't look like she belonged here. Her clothes were simple but foreign, and her skin had a certain bronze tint that made her seem out of place in the rugged terrain. But Jack didn't think too much about it. Right now, all that mattered was getting her to safety. The walk to the cabin felt longer than it should have. Jack's legs were tired from the river crossing, and the woman's weight, though light, made his arms ache. But he pressed on, one step at a time, focusing on the task at hand. When they finally reached the cabin, Jack set her down on the wooden porch and opened the door. Inside, the cabin was simple but warm. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Jack set the woman down on the nearest chair and started a pot of coffee, hoping it would warm both their bodies and spirits. As the coffee brewed, Jack turned his attention back to the woman. Her breathing had steadied, and her face had a slight flush to it from the warmth of the fire. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. He sat down beside her, waiting for her to wake up. Jack didn't know how long it would take, but he hoped she wouldn't be too frightened when she came to. He wasn't sure how an Apache woman would react to being saved by a stranger, especially a cowboy. But all he could do now was wait. Time seemed to drag on, and Jack's mind wandered. He thought about the woman's strength, how she had fought the current with everything she had. There was a certain fire in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. She wasn't like the other women he had met. There was something wild and untamed about her, something that made Jack feel both drawn to her and unsure of what to do next. Just then, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around, confused. Jack sat up straighter, watching her closely. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him. Her eyes were wide, alert, but there was also a hint of fear in them. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had expected this. She was probably wondering why he had helped her, why he had gone to such lengths to save her. Jack spoke softly, his voice gentle, trying to ease her fears. "You're safe now," he said. "You were drowning, and I saved you." The woman blinked, her confusion deepening. She tried to sit up, but Jack quickly stood and helped her. He gave her some water and a blanket to wrap around her shoulders. She didn't say anything, but Jack could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Jack watched her quietly, unsure of what to say or do. He didn't know if she would ever trust him, if she would ever understand why he had helped her. But for now, all he could do was offer her what little comfort he had. And as the night drew on, Jack realized that the rescue was only the beginning of something far more complicated than he had anticipated. The woman wasn't just anyone. She was part of a people who had long been at odds with his kind. And though he had saved her life, he had no idea what the future would hold for them both. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the small cabin, casting a warm glow that illuminated the dim room. Jack had made a simple meal, a bit of bread and beans, while the woman sat quietly by the fire, her eyes darting from the warmth of the flames to the man sitting across from her. She hadn't said much since she woke up, only nodding when Jack had offered her some water and food. The silence between them hung heavy in the air, thick with uncertainty. Jack watched her closely, still unsure of how to proceed. She was an Apache woman, and he knew enough about his people's history to understand that helping her, a stranger from a tribe that had long been in conflict with cowboys like him, might not be so easily accepted. But Jack was a man of actions, not words, and his actions had already spoken louder than anything he could say now. As the evening wore on, Jack tried to make her feel more at ease. He offered her a coat to keep warm, but she refused with a quiet shake of her head. Her dark eyes never left the fire for long, and Jack couldn't help but notice how tired she looked. She had the appearance of someone who had lived a difficult life, someone who had been through a lot. Her face was weathered from the harsh conditions of the wilderness, but there was a quiet strength about her that Jack couldn't ignore. Minutes turned to hours, and the silence between them became more comfortable, though it still carried a sense of unspoken tension. Jack knew that the night would pass with little conversation between them, but he was beginning to understand that it wasn't because of hostility. It was more out of necessity. The woman wasn't ready to speak yet, and Jack wasn't about to force her. He had his own past, his own reasons for being a man of few words. Perhaps she, too, carried a heavy burden of her own. Eventually, she stood up and walked slowly to the window, her movements cautious but steady. The night outside was dark, with only the stars in the sky and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Jack could tell that she was thinking, perhaps trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He stood up slowly, giving her space, and walked to the small cupboard at the back of the cabin. He didn't want to disturb her thoughts, but he knew he had to keep the fire going. The nights in this part of the world could be cold, and the woman needed warmth. It wasn't much, but it was the least he could do for her. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jack asked softly, not wanting to sound intrusive, but also knowing that silence couldn't last forever. He couldn't just let her stay in this uneasy quiet. He wanted to understand her, to know who she was, but he wasn't sure how to break the ice. She didn't answer right away, and for a moment Jack thought she might not answer at all. But then she spoke, her voice low and rough from the strain of the night. "My name is Yana," she said, turning slightly to face him. Her eyes met his for the first time since she had woken up. There was a depth in her gaze that Jack couldn't quite place, a mixture of pain, resilience, and something else he couldn't name. Yana, Jack repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. It sounded beautiful, foreign, and yet familiar at the same time. It's a good name. She nodded, a small flicker of recognition passing through her eyes. She didn't seem to want to say more, and Jack didn't press her further. Instead, he turned back to the fire, the warmth from it comforting in the silence. The night stretched on, and Ayana remained standing by the window, gazing out at the darkness. Jack wondered what she was thinking. Was she planning her escape? Or was she just waiting for the night to pass, for the storm to be over so that she could continue her journey? Jack didn't know, but he understood that he couldn't keep her here forever. She was an outsider, someone from a different world, and the cowboy life he led was one she would likely never understand. Yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this encounter. Maybe it was just his own loneliness playing tricks on him, but there was a connection, however small, between them. He had saved her life, yes, but he couldn't help but feel that there was more to it than that. What had brought her to the river in the first place? What was she running from? Jack didn't know, but the questions lingered in his mind. He returned to his chair by the fire, watching Ayana as she stood in the shadows. There was something haunting about her presence, as though she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. He didn't know what it was, but he could tell she had been through hardship. Jack wasn't sure if she would ever tell him what had happened to her, but in that moment he realized it didn't matter. He wasn't looking for answers. He was just looking for understanding, for a way to help her heal. Ayana turned from the window, her gaze landing on Jack. Her face was unreadable, but Jack could sense the change in her, the way the tension in her body seemed to ease just a little. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. She walked over to the fire and sat down across from him, her movements slow but deliberate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, the only sound filling the room. Jack wasn't sure what to do next, but he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The weight of the day, of the rescue, of the silence between them, it all seemed to dissipate. Finally, Ayana spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have saved me." It wasn't an accusation, but more of a statement, as though she was still trying to understand why Jack had done what he did. Jack leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the confusion. "Why not?" he asked simply. He wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. He was genuinely curious. She shook her head, her eyes lowering to the floor. "Because you're a cowboy, you're my enemy, and yet you risked your life for mine." Jack's heart ached, though he didn't show it. He understood what she meant. The history between cowboys and the Apache people was filled with violence and mistrust. But that didn't mean they couldn't find common ground, didn't mean they couldn't understand each other, even if it was just for a brief moment. "I didn't save you because you're an Apache," Jack said softly. "I saved you because you needed help, that's all." Ayana didn't respond right away, but her eyes met his again, and for the first time there was a flicker of something like gratitude in them. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The silence stretched on, but this time it felt different. There was no more tension between them, no more distrust. It was just two people caught in a moment of quiet understanding. Jack didn't know where this would lead or what would happen the next day, but for now, they shared something that was rare in this harsh world. A moment of peace, however fleeting. And for the first time since they had met, Jack allowed himself to relax. He didn't know if Ayana would ever feel completely safe with him, but he hoped that, in time, she might come to see him not as an enemy, but as someone who had saved her life without asking for anything in return. The fire continued to burn, and the night stretched on. And in that small cabin, the two of them, strangers from different worlds, sat together in silence, sharing a rare moment of understanding. The fire had long since died down to a few glowing embers, and the quiet of the night had settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Jack and Ayana had spent the hours since dinner in silence, both lost in their thoughts. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a cold, crisp air that crept through the cracks in the cabin's walls. But inside there was warmth, both from the dying fire and the unspoken connection between the two of them. Ayana sat close to the fire, her body still wrapped in the blanket Jack had given her. Her eyes flickered occasionally to Jack, who sat across from her, his back against the wall. He was looking out the small window, his face shadowed in the dim light, lost in his own thoughts. The air between them was different now, more comfortable than before. It wasn't the uneasy silence it had been earlier. There was a certain calm in the room now, a sense that they were both coming to terms with the strange situation they found themselves in. The past few days had been full of unexpected twists, and neither of them knew exactly what would happen next. But for now, they simply shared the space in a way that didn't feel forced. Yana was the first to break the silence, her voice low and hesitant. "Thank you for saving me." She spoke softly, but her words carried a weight. It was the first time she had acknowledged the rescue so directly, and Jack felt a quiet pride in hearing it. But he didn't let himself smile. Instead, he looked at her with a soft expression, his voice steady. "You don't have to thank me," Jack said. "It was the right thing to do. You were in trouble, and I did what anyone would have done." Ayana didn't reply immediately. She sat back, hugging the blanket around her shoulders a little tighter, her gaze falling to the floor. "Not everyone would have," she said quietly, her words carrying the faintest trace of bitterness. Jack could tell that she was wrestling with something inside. There was still a part of her that didn't trust him completely, a part of her that couldn't quite accept the kindness he had shown her. Jack shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. He wasn't about to let the conversation fall back into silence. He knew that this was a turning point, that if they were ever going to understand each other, they had to be honest, at least with themselves. "I'm not asking for your trust, Ayana," Jack said gently. "I know it's hard. I know you probably see me as an enemy, but I'm not the one you think I am, and you don't have to believe that right away." Yana looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face for something. Maybe the truth, maybe some sign that he wasn't just another cowboy with his own agenda. She held his gaze for a long moment, and Jack didn't look away. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but there was also something else, something like hope. "I don't know why you helped me," Yana finally said. Her voice was a little stronger now, more sure of itself. "We're not supposed to trust each other. My people, they've fought against yours for so long, and I'm not supposed to be here like this. In your house, in your company." Jack nodded, understanding her words. He knew that the history between cowboys and the Apache was filled with mistrust and violence. He didn't expect her to forget that, nor did he expect her to simply forgive everything that had happened before. But he had to believe that something as simple as a single act of kindness could make a difference. "I know," Jack said quietly. "I know what history says. But that doesn't mean we can't try to be different. I didn't save you because of your people or mine. I saved you because you needed it, that's all." For a long moment, Yana was silent. Her face softened as she thought about his words, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her. Jack could see the wheels turning in her mind, the conflict between the old beliefs she had grown up with and the new reality she was facing. Yana finally sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's hard to believe that something so simple can be true. I've spent my whole life believing that people like you, cowboys, settlers, they were all the same. I didn't think any of you could be different." Jack felt a pang of sadness, but he didn't let it show. He understood the pain she carried with her, the weight of the past, and how difficult it was to break free from old patterns. He wasn't asking her to change everything in one conversation. That would take time, understanding, and trust, things that couldn't be rushed. "People are complicated," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes and I've done things I regret, but that doesn't mean I can't try to do better. And I'm not asking you to forget everything. I'm just asking for a chance to show you that not all of us are the same." Iana looked down again, her fingers twisting nervously in the fabric of the blanket. There was a pause between them, an almost uncomfortable silence, but it wasn't the same kind of silence they had shared earlier. This time, it felt like an opportunity for something to change, even if it was just a small shift. Slowly, Ayana nodded. Maybe you're right. Maybe there's more to you than I thought. I don't know yet, but I'll try to understand." Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was a step forward. That was all he could ask for. In the world they lived in, that was all anyone could ask for, small steps toward understanding, no matter how difficult they might be. The night continued on, the fire now just a faint glow in the center of the room. Yana sat quietly, lost in her own thoughts, and Jack respected her need for space. He wasn't in a rush to fill the silence. The conversation had already gone further than he expected, and that was enough for tonight. He stood up after a while, stretching his legs, and moved toward the door. Yana glanced up at him, her face still thoughtful but less guarded than before. "I'm going to bed," Jack said. "We'll talk more tomorrow." You're welcome to stay in here tonight, or you can sleep in the other room. I'll leave it up to you. Iana gave a small nod, but she didn't speak. Jack knew she had a lot on her mind, and he wasn't going to push her for answers. He respected her space, and he knew that time was the only thing that would allow them both to heal from their pasts. With one last glance at her, Jack stepped into the other room, leaving Iana alone by the fire. The door creaked shut behind him, and the cabin was once again filled with the sound of the wind outside and the soft crackle of the remaining embers in the hearth. Iana sat there for a long time, lost in the flickering light. For the first time since Jack had saved her, she allowed herself to relax a little. The fear and the tension that had gripped her for so long slowly began to ease. She didn't know what the future held or whether she would ever truly trust Jack, but for the first time, she felt the smallest sense of possibility. A possibility that maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to be the way they had always been. And with that thought, she closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire comfort her, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new chances. The morning light broke through the small cabin window, casting long beams of sunlight across the wooden floor. The quiet of the night had given way to the soft sounds of the day, birds calling from the trees, the wind rustling through the leaves outside. Inside, the cabin felt warm, though the air was cool, and the fire had burned down to a few glowing embers. Yana was already awake, sitting near the window, staring out at the vast desert landscape beyond. Her dark eyes seemed to be lost in thought, her gaze distant, as though she was weighing something important. Jack, still groggy from sleep, stretched his arms above his head before sitting up on the small cot by the fire. He looked at Ayana, noticing the quiet stillness that hung between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like the calm before something bigger. Something that neither of them had quite figured out yet. Yana hadn't moved from her spot by the window. Her posture was relaxed, but Jack could sense the weight of the past pressing on her, the thoughts running through her mind like a fast-moving river. She had been through so much in her life, and Jack could only imagine what it was like to carry that kind of burden day after day. The history between their people, the distrust, the pain, wasn't something that could be erased overnight. But the fact that she was still here, still sitting with him in this cabin, meant something. Jack stood up slowly and walked over to where she sat. He didn't want to startle her, but he also didn't want to let this moment of silence drag on. There was something in the air that needed to be addressed. "Iana," he said gently, his voice breaking the quiet. "I think we need to talk. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable, but I also don't want to leave things hanging between us." Iana turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she didn't say anything, and Jack wondered if she was even going to respond. He stood there, his hands resting at his sides, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Iana let out a soft breath and turned fully to face him. "What do you want to talk about, Jack?" she asked, her voice steady but low. There was no anger in her words, no resentment, just a simple question as though she was bracing herself for something. Jack hesitated for a moment, not sure how to begin. He could feel the weight of the conversation ahead, but he knew it was necessary. They couldn't stay in this place of uncertainty forever. They needed to figure out what was going to happen next. "I know we're not from the same world," Jack started slowly, choosing his words carefully. "And I know that you've been through a lot. You've seen things I can't even imagine, but I need to know where we stand. I need to know what you're thinking because I can't keep guessing." Iana looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to be taking in his words, weighing them as though she was trying to decide whether to trust him with more of her thoughts. She was quiet for a moment, and Jack could see that the walls she had built around herself were still there, thick and strong. "I don't know what to think," Iana finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything is confusing. I don't know if I should hate you or be grateful. I don't know if I should trust you or keep my distance." Her words hit Jack harder than he expected. He had known that it wouldn't be easy for her to let go of her distrust, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. She was struggling with her own feelings, her own fear of what might happen if she let herself get too close to him. Jack understood that, but it still hurt. "I don't want you to hate me," Jack said softly, his voice sincere. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away. Hell, I don't expect that, but I want to try. I want to try to understand you, and maybe you'll try to understand me." Yana's eyes softened a little, and she nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I've spent my whole life seeing people like you as the enemy. I've been taught to hate you, to fear you. And now I'm here, sitting in your cabin, eating your food. I don't know how to make sense of it." Jack felt the tension in the air, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. The fact that Ayanna was being this honest with him, telling him her fears and doubts, meant that there was a chance. She hadn't closed herself off completely. She was still willing to talk, still willing to listen. And that, Jack realized, was more than he could have asked for. "I know," Jack said quietly. "I know it's not easy. I know that the history between our people isn't something that can just be forgotten. But I also know that we're not our history. We don't have to be what others expect us to be." Yana looked at him, her gaze steady but still guarded. She didn't say anything right away, but Jack could see the struggle in her eyes. She was fighting with herself, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since she had fallen into that river. She had been saved by a man she had been taught to fear, and now she was sitting here, wondering if there was any way to bridge the gap between them. Jack stepped closer, sitting down across from her. He didn't want to push her too hard, but he wanted her to know that he was here for her. He wasn't going to abandon her, not now. "We're not so different, Ayanna," Jack said gently. "I've lived through my own battles, my own struggles. Maybe they're different from yours, but that doesn't mean they don't matter. I want to help you if you'll let me. I want to make things right, even if it takes time." Yana's eyes flickered, and Jack saw something shift in her expression, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. She didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a hint of something softer in her gaze. "I don't know if I can forgive everything that's happened," she said quietly, her voice more vulnerable than Jack had ever heard it. "But maybe we can start with one step, one small step at a time." Jack felt his heart lift at her words. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough, one step at a time. "We'll take it slow," Jack promised. "No rush, just one step at a time." Yana nodded again, her eyes meeting his. For the first time since she had arrived at the cabin, Jack saw a flicker of trust in her gaze. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, and for that, Jack was grateful. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, but there was no longer any tension between them. Yana had opened up, and Jack had listened. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward, together. The days that followed were quieter than Jack had expected. The harsh winds of the desert seemed to carry away the tension that had once hung heavy between him and Ayanna. It was as if the stillness of the land had finally worked its way into their hearts, allowing them both to settle into a routine. Each day they spent time together in silence, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. Yana had stopped sitting by the window all day, and Jack had stopped keeping his distance. They shared simple tasks like preparing meals or tending to the small fire, but there was no rush. No expectations. Slowly, they had started to find comfort in each other's company. Yana's eyes had softened over the past few days. She was no longer constantly looking over her shoulder, no longer worried that Jack might suddenly turn on her. He had kept his promise. There had been no grand gestures, no sudden acts of kindness meant to prove himself. Jack had simply been there, just as he had promised. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Yana turned to Jack with a question that had been on her mind for a while. "Why did you stay here, on this land?" she asked, her voice breaking the quiet of the cabin. She had asked the question without any particular expectation, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was hoping for an answer. Jack looked up from the small task he was working on. He had been carving a piece of wood, his hands busy and his mind still. Yana's question caught him off guard, but not in a bad way. It was one of those questions that you don't think about until someone asks it, but once it's asked, you realize you've been wondering about it too. He paused, considering the question for a moment. "I suppose I stayed here because it was the only place left. The world out there, it's full of people trying to fight each other. And I've spent most of my life fighting in one way or another, whether it was against the land or other people or myself. I didn't want to keep living like that, so I found a place where I could be alone and quiet." Yana nodded slowly, as if she understood. She seemed to be thinking about his words carefully, mulling over the quiet truths in them. "You don't have anyone else?" she asked, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a while. Jack didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked out the window toward the horizon as though searching for the right words. The landscape outside was still peaceful. but it had not always been that way for him. It had been a long time since he had had anyone in his life who cared about him, or anyone he could call family. He had learned to be self-sufficient, to rely on his own strength, but it had come at a cost. "I had a family once," Jack said finally, his voice soft but steady. "A long time ago, but they're gone now, and since then I've mostly kept to myself. I suppose that's how it is when you spend so much of your life fighting. You forget what it's like to let people in." Yana listened closely, her eyes never leaving him. She could see the weight of his words, the silent ache that lay beneath them. She had known loss in her own life, loss that was too deep to put into words. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the pain that came with being alone, with feeling like the world had turned its back on you. For a moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding. Both of them had been through things that had left them scarred in ways that no one else could fully understand. But in that quiet, they found something important. They didn't need to explain everything. Sometimes just being there was enough. The silence was broken when Ayana stood up and walked over to where Jack was sitting. She stood beside him for a moment, her hands clasped in front of her, and then, without saying a word, she took the small carving knife from his hand. Jack looked at her, surprised by the gesture. "What are you doing?" Ayana gave him a small smile, the first one he had seen in days. "I'm going to finish it for you," she said, her voice quiet but confident. Jack laughed softly. "You've got more patience than I do." Ayana didn't respond, but the smile on her face grew a little more genuine. She set to work on the piece of wood, her hands moving gracefully over it, shaping it with the knife as if she had done it 100 times before. Jack watched her for a while, his own work forgotten. It was strange, but somehow in that small cabin with the sun setting outside and the fire crackling softly, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of solitude he had once craved, but something more. It was the peace of companionship, of sharing the quiet moments with someone who understood. As the days passed, they found more and more of these small, quiet moments. They would talk sometimes, other times they would work side by side in comfortable silence. And gradually, as time moved on, Jack realized that he didn't feel alone anymore. He had Ayana now, and though he wasn't sure where their paths would lead, he knew that for the first time in a long while, he had someone by his side. One evening, as they sat around the small table, sharing another simple meal of beans and bread, Ayana spoke again. "You were right," she said, her voice low but clear. "We're not so different. I've spent so much time fighting against people I didn't know, against things I didn't understand, and now here I am." Jack looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "And now here we are," Ayana nodded. "Maybe that's all we can do, just take one step at a time." Jack smiled, a real smile this time. "One step at a time," he repeated. It was simple, but it was the truth. They couldn't change the past, but they could change how they moved forward, and that for now was enough. As the days turned into weeks, the cabin became a place of quiet refuge. Jack and Ayana were no longer two strangers from opposing worlds. They were simply two people trying to make sense of their lives. There were still things they didn't understand about each other, still moments of doubt and hesitation. But they were learning, slowly, that sometimes the best way to move forward was simply to keep going together. One morning, as the sun rose over the desert once more, Jack stood outside the cabin, looking out at the wide open land. He had no idea what the future held, no idea what Ayana's next steps would be. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid of what might come. He wasn't sure if they would stay in this cabin forever or if they would go their separate ways eventually. But whatever happened, Jack knew one thing: he wasn't alone anymore, and that was enough. Ayana came up behind him, standing silently for a moment before speaking. "Where will we go next?" Jack turned to her, a quiet smile on his face. "Wherever the road takes us." She smiled back, the smallest hint of hope in her eyes. "Then let's walk it together." And so, side by side, they faced the unknown, each step a new chapter in their journey, no longer alone but together.